So it's my first time that they are here for KEC. I'm Sören Lenz, and I'm, since the 1st of January, Executive Secretary in Strasbourg. And I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Conference of European Churches, and especially, I say it, a warm welcome to our speakers. Thank you all for having made the effort to come to cold Paris instead of staying close to your fireplace at home. Unfortunately, our General Secretary Heikki Huttunen will be late, so it's my pleasure to welcome you in Paris. I'd like to especially greet you on behalf of Pierre-Olivier Lechaud. It's the Dean of the Protestant Institute of Theology here in Paris, who due to other engagements can't be with us. But it's a great honor for me to welcome particularly Nicolas Czernokrak, sorry for the pronunciation of the name, Dean of the Orthodox Institute Saint-Serge, Paris. Welcome. It's to you to say welcome. I think it's your institute is here in the building as well. Exactly 200 years ago, in 1818, a novel by the young British author Mary Shelley was published in London. You know maybe the title, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. The well-known story of Victor Frankenstein, a young scientist who creates a grotesque but sapient creature in an unorthodox scientific experiment. As you know, the story has inspired film producers, playwrights, and other artists in the 20th century. The popularity may be due to the enormous scientific progress which has achieved during the 20th and 21st century. To be like God and to become capable of creating human beings in His image. This was no longer a utopic dream, but a possibility for a near future in that time. But we know such a dream is older. In the old Jewish legend of the golem, which exists in various forms since the 11th century, the golem, created entirely from inanimate matter, is an anthropomorphic being. Golem is also the embryo in the mother's womb. For example, in Psalm 139. It becomes alive only when the Shem, one of the names of God, is mounted on its forehead. I would like to stress two remarkable aspects concerning the topic of our conference. First of all, the golem and the creature of Frankenstein, they don't have a name. They are not named. They are nameless. God calls by name, as we know in Genesis 5 or Isaiah 43. God calls into life to live in a relationship. Relationship means responsibility and reciprocity. Secondly, my last remark, both creatures, Golem and Frankenstein's creature, slip out of control. Interesting is that both Frankenstein's creature, I don't like the term monster, as well as the Golem are developing human feelings like love, need to be accepted by others, but also hate and the desire for destruction. Playing God, are we going to be Frankenstein? Or Rabbi Löwe in Prague, who created the golem? Is gene editing not the same as to modify inanimate matter, a sort of golem? Thus the intention to improve human existence justify manipulation of and with the human matter itself? Playing God. Very often literature is largely ahead concerning human progress. And very often authors and other artists have a premonition of what can go well or wrong. Remember Aldous Huxley, George Orwell. They may be the prophets of our century. But now I stop completely. I will keep quiet and give the floor to our moderator, to the moderator of our Thematic Reference Group of the KEC, Professor Dr. Ulrik Nissen. Welcome to you as well. And
thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here, and it's a pleasure meeting Sören and Barbara Weber for the first time. It is the office in Strasbourg that we normally have a close cooperation with, so it's a pleasure to meet you here for the first time. Apart from that, I want to welcome you all here to this conference. First of all, I want to welcome all of you participants. It's a very nice number of participants, around 30, 35 regular participants, and then other people coming in. So we, over the conference, we will be around 40 or 50 people taking part in the conference. You come from a lot of different churches, denominations, and geographical contexts. So I hope that we will all have some very thoughtful and stimulating days here on this very important topic of gene editing. And then I would, of course, also like to give a particular welcome to our main speakers. First of all, to Robin Lovell-Batch from the Francis Crick Institute in London, who will speak later this morning. And Peter Darbrock from the Friedrich Alexander Universität in Erlangen, who will give a talk on the more Protestant perspectives of this issue. Miltiadis Vansos, there you are, from the Aristotle University in Thessaloniki, and Bruno Saintot from the Jesuit faculty in Paris. I'm not sure if you're here right now, but he will come later. And then there's Lawrence Lwoff from the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, and finally Mark Hunyadi, who's here from the Catholic University in Leuven. So thank you all very much for coming to this conference and helping us to wrestle with this issue in a thoughtful and appropriate manner. Also, I want to express a gratitude to all the other members of the Thematic Reference Group who have arranged this conference and who will have various roles through the conference. They are, there's Murdo Macdonald, who came in late, and we have a chair for him up here, and we are very grateful that you came in time for your talk this morning. Murdo Macdonald is from the Church of Scotland, and Brendan McCarthy from the Church of England, Konstantinos Konarakis from the Church of Greece, Migo Rimmel from the Estonian Council of Churches, and Luca Sabarino, who is also here somewhere. Can't see him right now. There he is, from the Italian Valdensian Church, and Jean Boboc from the Orthodox Church. So, and then Julia Vidovic, who has done a very important work in arranging this whole conference from the Serbian Orthodox Church, and she has, together with the KEC office in Brussels and Strasbourg, done a tremendous work. So thank you. She's there at the back seat, humble back seat, but thank you very much, Julia, for all the work that you have done. And then finally, myself, who has had the task of being the moderator of this working group for the last working period, and I am part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Denmark. And then I want to thank also for the economic support that has made the conference possible. And this has, first of all, been from the KEC organization, but also the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church has contributed a substantial amount of money, without which this conference would not have been possible. So thank you very much to both of these, both the KEC and the Danish Lutheran Church, and finally to the Protestant Institute of Theology for hosting the conference and for the role that the Orthodox faculty here has played in this conference as well. So there are many people to be thanked. So we are in sort of an atmosphere of gratitude when we go forward with this conference. And now, now we also have to be careful to stick somewhat to our time schedule. So I will, and we need to have time for Murdo's presentation of. The group has. You have all received a copy of a report that the group has made on gene editing, and Murdo will talk about some of the scientific issues that our group have been dealing with in this report. And the scientific part of that report was primarily Murdo, who was he was the primary author of that part, and then the group has of course discussed it at our group meetings. And but Murdo will introduce that later. In the last half part of that report, we raise some more theological and philosophical, societal perspectives, and Brendan McCarthy has been the primary author of that part, and then we have, of course, also discussed that part at our reference group meetings. In this last part of our report on the ethical issues, some of our, and I will just take them more broadly, and then you can, of course, read more about it in the report. But there are primarily two sections, so to speak. There is one where we differentiate between a consequentialist and a more principle-oriented approach to these issues. And from the consequentialist approach, some of the questions that we raise is how gene editing in general can be understood as how it can be seen from the perspective of improving the human condition. So this is a central consequentialist ethical question to be raised in this regard. Another term that is introduced in this section is a precautionary principle, understood as a principle which demands a justification before permitting any risk-creating activity. So we acknowledge that this field of gene editing, along with other bioethical new emerging technologies, that there is also an element of risk, and that this precautionary principle requires a justification before permitting this risk-creating activity. Then we also raise the concept of wisdom. So even if we could say that all our hesitations are somehow resolved, there is still the question of wisdom. So is there and it's particularly with regard to the whole discussion of eugenics. So is there a risk of a scientific or social eugenics embedded in or as a consequence of some of these new technologies? That's also a question that we raise, even if we do not, I wouldn't say that we in the report come to answers, but we raise some questions that are important to reflect on. And then in the other part of apart from the consequentialist approaches, we raise these questions. So we formulate some deliberations on the fundamental principles of right and wrong, and here we also use the concepts that are also reflected in the heading of our present conference, namely this term, playing God. And in the report, we speak about the difference between the concept of playing God versus playing human, and what our role and mandate is as human beings. From my own perspective, and this is not in the report, so this is the group cannot be held accountable for what I'm saying right now. But I have a certain hesitation with regard to this concept of playing God, because I also think that sometimes we risk turning the discussion in a wrong direction. So maybe this is not really if we focus too much on the concept of playing God, because there is a certain rhetoric in this terminology, then maybe we must be careful not to forget to address the really important questions, because I think most people would say that this concept in itself has such a both powerful but also somewhat misleading association. So when we use a concept like playing God, even if there is a question mark, we still have to be careful not to forget the really important questions. Later on in our report, I would say that we do address some of these more really important questions, and this is particularly done from the perspective of 4 principles. These are 4 principles that the Church of England has been using in some of their documents on biotechnology. It's the principles of safety, efficacy, ethics, and prudence. So first of all, one should ask with regard to safety. Is it safe both with regard to social, physical, and mental aspects? With regard to efficacy, the central question is what is realistically achievable? And ethics, a central question is what course of action is life-affirming? And in this section on what is life-affirming, we raise some issues on what the human being really is. And this ties in with some of Sören's comments, this whole idea of human beings as relational beings and the responsibility that arises from human beings as relational. And we have a short formulation there which holds some potential power, I would say, where it says, great care must be taken over the impact that genetic editing research might have on the value that we place on human life. And this question on how this may influence the value on human life, I think is a central question that we will probably also return to several times during this conference. Finally, with regard to prudence, and this of course has some affiliation with the whole concept of wisdom. There is still this question still remains: what is wise to do? What is an expression of prudence? And in that sense, there is an element of virtue in these principles as well, because this prudence concept somewhat also resembles the whole Aristotelian concept of phronesis. So what is wise? What is prudent to do? And here we have at page 18 in this document that you have a formulation that is quite central for the report, where it says that human genome editing is arguably the bioethical equivalent of splitting the atom, an ability which has brought us both nuclear power and nuclear weapons. We ought to proceed with very great care to maximize the benefits for society and guard against its misuses. So there is, for many reasons, particularly with regard to somatic gene editing, there are important potentials in gene editing, but especially with regard to germline editing, the report is is cautious, and the report also warns against germline editing. So I think this differentiation between somatic gene editing and germline gene editing is very important, and I think we will also hear that when Laurence Loif presents her talk on the Oviedo Convention. And the report also concludes with a strong warning against germline editing, with a formulation on page 19. As Christians, we are called to take a wider perspective on the issues which affect us as individuals and society, and to care for the most vulnerable in our society. We would strongly urge that national and international prohibitions be put on the use of gene editing to alter the human germline, and to seek a more socially just and less risky solution to the environmental, social, and health problems being addressed. So the topic of gene editing that we are discussing here is both something that holds very important potentials, and I think Murdo will also mention some of that, and Robin Lovell-Badge will certainly mention some of that. But it is also something where, especially with relation to germline editing, gives reason to serious caution, and as we say in our report, and this is also reflected in the Oviedo Convention, that germline editing is something that we believe should not be allowed. So with these words, I will give the word to Murdo, and look very much forward to these days with all of you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this morning. My apologies for my late arrival. Travelling from Edinburgh was a bit challenging this morning. The beast from the east, as it's referred to in the UK, presents challenges with the weather. But I'm conscious that although I'm here in a role that I play with the Church of Scotland, I'm here also as part of the working group, the Conference of European Churches working group. I'm very much indebted to Ulrik and my colleagues on the working group who have been involved in drafting this report, and in particular to Julia for pulling together this conference and drawing together some very important and impressive individuals. Thank you very much for joining us. My background professionally is as a molecular biologist. I studied genetics a long time ago, but I now work full-time for the Church of Scotland, working on ethical issues in relation to science more widely. And I'm conscious that I'm in the presence of people who are much wiser and much more learned than I am, but I hope that we can all learn from each other as we work through some of the issues that are presented to us through this particular issue of human gene editing. I should say at the outset that we as a group have chosen to look specifically at modification, genetic modification in humans. We're aware, as we say, that there are opportunities and research going on in modification, genetic modification in other organisms, many of which will have very profound effects on us as humans, as well as the organisms which are being modified. But this paper is focusing particularly on genetic modification in humans. We are aware of the fact that many people, it's estimated that about 400 million people worldwide are affected by single gene defects, diseases which are caused by single gene defects. So while the individual issues may be small numbers, in total there are large numbers affected of people, of humans affected by single gene defect genetic issues. As Ulrik has already alluded to, there are lots of questions that arise out of the paper, we have wrestled with some of these questions, and we've sought to answer some of these questions. But we're very much aware that this is a very fast-moving field, and that things almost every day there are new opportunities for this kind of technology to be applied, and we're conscious that there are real issues as we seek to bring our reflection as people of faith in these situations to keep up with the topic. We're also aware of many of the issues that arise out of some of the ethical questions and the legal questions, and we will be looking more closely at some of these as we progress. I want, as we look at this issue, to refer us to a passage that many of us will be familiar with from the Bible, from the book of Micah, the prophet Micah, chapter 6 and verse 8. And I'm sure you can read that. God has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And I want to draw out some themes that arise in this paper, concentrating on the second half of this particular text. To act justly, as I said, this is a very fast-moving field, and the legal situation often struggles to keep up with the technology, and we need to be aware that this is a real issue. And we also need to be conscious of some of the other influences that are driving some of the technologies. We know that many scientists and many researchers are driven by a desire to see a better world and to bring about change for betterment. But we're also aware that there are political pressures, that are commercial pressures, and we must be conscious that there are justice issues. And I'm aware that there are many people who are wrestling with these issues from a legislative and a legal and an ethical perspective. But we have to have at the forefront, I think, a question of justice, how we use these technologies in a just perspective. So I would urge us to have this at the heart of much of our discussion. We are aware that we can see many opportunities to use these technologies, not just in terms of single gene technologies defects, but perhaps in the future working towards making changes which wouldn't just be restoring to health, but perhaps moving towards what would be seen as an improving of humans. So moving towards what might be termed designer babies is the term that's often used in the public parlance. But we must be aware that there are justice issues as we apply these technologies, that we have to be careful how we use these technologies. And these technologies are available and are being used at this point, and we must seek to use them justly. Justice is balanced in Scripture and in our society by the question of mercy. To love mercy is emphasized through much of our faith, and the question of how we use these technologies and deploying them in ways in which we use them to improve people's lives. And as we point out on page 7, many would argue that it would be wrong to not use these God-given abilities. And so to be merciful using these technologies is our responsibility. So part of our faith journey as we walk with God, many would argue, would be to act in a merciful way and to therefore deploy these technologies in ways which bring life-enhancing and life improvement situations to other human beings. And I think that has to be very much within our discussions. And we are aware this is a copy of a newspaper headline from the UK, but we're also aware that many would argue that although designer babies is not a term that we might want to use in the public domain, the religious organizations are often seen as being in a blocking position, seeking to prevent the progress of science. And we have to be careful that that public perception isn't something that causes us not to be seen to be merciful, because that is part of our calling as people of faith. And to walk humbly with God, I think, is perhaps in some ways the most challenging part. We need, as people of faith, to walk, to move forward, and these technologies allow us the opportunity to move forward. But walking humbly with God is one of, perhaps, as I say, the most challenging aspects of this. How do we understand how we as humans use the opportunities that are presented through these technologies and use them in wise ways, but use them in humble ways? How do we walk humbly with God? By, as Ulrik has already said, by choosing to play God, if that's the terminology which we seek to use, and we want to use that wisely. Are we in some way seeking to usurp the position of God and therefore not walking humbly with God? Would be one of the questions which, to me, would be fundamental to what we do. As a scientist, I can't resist the opportunity to share a little bit of the wonder of what we're doing as we explore these concepts, and I'm aware that Professor Lovell-Badge will explore many of these issues, but we're familiar with the DNA structure, the chromosomes that are found in the nucleus of all of our cells, and this is a very simplified diagram of all of our cells. But do we fully understand what we're doing when we're talking about genetic modification? This is a DNA sequence. It looks like gobbledygook to most of us, but it makes sense because this is the DNA, this is the code which makes up what is physically you and makes up who we are as human beings in many ways. It's an enormously long set of molecules. In total, 3 billion base pairs. 3 billion is a very large number, so I sometimes feel that I have to break that down, and we do that in the text of what we talked about that we've presented to you. A book that we're familiar with, the Bible, contains approximately 800,000 words, which has approximately 3 million letters in total. So if you hold up a Bible, I don't know if there's a Bible here present, but if we had a Bible with us, we would be holding a book that had approximately 3 million letters within it. So that to make 3 billion base pairs, so the equivalent of the number of letters that are in the human genome, we would need 1,000 books. I couldn't search the internet for a picture of 1,000 books. I couldn't find a picture of 1,000 books. So here's a picture of 100 books, which I copied 10 times. So here's what 1,000 books looks like. So if we are talking about changing a single base pair in the human genome, what we're talking about is changing a single letter within one of these 1,000 books. And so that's what we're doing when we're talking about gene editing, if we're talking about changing a single letter. And if we were to pick up these books and to read through these 1,000 books, if we read one letter per second, then it would take us 95 years to read through these 1,000 books. These numbers are absolutely enormous, and as I say, humility is a question that we need to bring as we think about what we're doing here scientifically. Ulrik's already alluded to the questions of safety, efficacy, ethics, and prudence as we approach these questions, and I won't delay us any longer as we look at this. But as we tackle these questions around the scientific, the ethical, the legal, and the theological issues, as we think about the philosophy behind so much of what we do, we need to consider many of these issues because these are important issues driving us forward as we work as people of faith in the situations in which we live. So we need to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God, because that is what God has called us to. And this is why scientists need to think about their situation, because science has limits. Thank you very much.